The county clerk in Harrow kept his records in a basement office that smelled of mildew and old paper. Among the property ledgers and tax assessments, there existed a gap. Not an obvious one, but the kind that became apparent only if you were looking for something specific and couldn't find it. Between 1883 and 1898, a settlement called Millbrook appeared and disappeared from official documentation with a peculiar irregularity, sometimes present in one record and absent from another compiled the same year. This inconsistency troubled no one. The clerk who maintained these records in 1903 had never been asked about Millbrook, and he would not have known what to say if someone had asked. His predecessor, a man named Wallace Greer, who had held the position from 1879 until his retirement in 1901, had mentioned once that certain communities preferred minimal documentation, and that respecting such preferences was part of maintaining good relations with the rural townships. He had not elaborated, and no one had pressed him to. The road to Millbrook branched off from the main county route about 8 miles north of the town of Corsham. In 1887, this branch was still passable by wagon, though the ruts had deepened and the bridges across the creek beds needed repair that no one seemed inclined to provide. By 1895, the road had deteriorated to the point that only someone on foot or horseback could navigate it with any confidence. By 1903, it was barely distinguishable from a deer trail. The valley itself lay in a fold of land between two wooded ridges, accessible from the south and effectively isolated from the north and east by steep terrain and dense forest. It was good land for timber, adequate for farming, and possessed a creek with sufficient water year-round. In the 1840s, when Jonas Pettigrew first surveyed it, he recognized its potential immediately, not because the land was exceptional, but because it was remote enough that a man could operate with minimal interference from county authorities or competing interests. Pettigrew had come from Pennsylvania, where he had worked in his father's sawmill until a dispute over business practices led him to seek opportunities elsewhere. He brought with him 12 men, German immigrants who'd been working in the Pennsylvania timber industry and were willing to relocate for steady wages and the possibility of eventually owning land. They built the first structures in the winter of 1841, a sawmill, a bunkhouse, and a small office building constructed of the same oak they were processing. The settlement that grew around the mill was never formally incorporated. It had no official charter, no elected officials, no legal standing as a municipality. It was simply a collection of people who lived near the mill and whose lives were organized around its operation. This informality suited everyone involved. Pettigrew preferred minimal oversight. The workers, many of whom had complicated histories in their countries of origin, appreciated the lack of scrutiny. The few families who arrived later, attracted by cheap land and distance from more settled areas, had their own reasons for valuing privacy. By 1850, the population had reached approximately 60 people. By 1860, it had grown to 90. The 1870 census listed 112 residents, though the census taker noted that several households had been reluctant to provide complete information and that he suspected his count was incomplete. The mill prospered in an unremarkable way. It produced barrel staves, railroad ties, lumber for construction, the ordinary outputs of a rural timber operation. Pettigrew maintained contracts with buyers downstream and paid his workers regularly, if not generously. The community developed the basic infrastructure of rural life, a one-room school that met irregularly depending on whether there was a teacher available, a general store that carried goods ordered quarterly from suppliers in larger towns, a Baptist church where services were held on alternating Sundays by a circuit preacher who served several communities in the area. There were tensions, certainly. Any community of that size and composition would have them. There were disputes about wages, about land boundaries, about who was responsible for maintaining shared resources like the road and the bridges. There were conflicts rooted in ethnic differences, religious differences, personal animosities that had nothing to do with the present and everything to do with histories people had brought with them from elsewhere. But these were ordinary tensions, managed through ordinary means: conversation, negotiation, occasionally the intervention of respected elders like Pettigrew or the preacher or one of the older German settlers who had been there since the beginning. Nothing in the first 30 years of Millbrook's existence suggested it would become notable for anything other than its eventual disappearance, which was the common fate of small timber settlements once the easily accessible trees were exhausted. Then something changed. The nature of that change is where the documentary record becomes unreliable, where accounts diverge and the gaps in official records become too significant to ignore. The first person to notice that something was wrong, according to one version of events, was a woman named Catherine Hollis. She had married into one of the mill worker families in 1878 and had given birth to 3 children by 1883. She was known in the community as someone who paid attention to details, who noticed when things were out of place or when people were acting differently than usual. In the spring of 1884, Catherine began mentioning to other women in the settlement that the children were behaving strangely. They were playing games that she didn't recognize, using words that didn't seem to come from any of the families. When she asked her oldest daughter where she had learned a particular chant, the girl said it came from the teaching, but couldn't or wouldn't explain what that meant. Other mothers confirmed similar observations. The children, particularly those between the ages of 5 and 12, had developed patterns of behavior that seemed to have emerged suddenly and spread rapidly. They gathered in groups at the edge of the settlement, near where the forest began. They drew symbols in the dirt that none of the adults could interpret. They spoke about someone or something they called the keeper, though they became evasive when adults asked for clarification. This account appears in a letter written by Catherine Hollis to her sister in Virginia, dated May 1884. The letter was preserved by the sister's descendants and eventually donated to a county historical society in the 1960s. The letter is matter-of-fact in tone, more puzzled than alarmed. Catherine writes that she cannot tell whether the children's behavior is a harmless game that has gotten elaborate or whether it represents something that adults should be concerned about. She mentions that her husband has said children have always had strange games and that interfering too much would only make those games more appealing. The letter ends with a sentence that was later underlined in red ink by whoever archived it. John says I worry too much, but there is something in how they look at us now, like they know something we don't, and it unsettles me more than I can properly explain. A different version of events places the beginning earlier and attributes the first observations not to Catherine Hollis, but to Ernst Kehl, one of the original German settlers. Kehl, who was in his 50s by 1884 and had children and grandchildren in the community, allegedly noticed changes in the summer of 1883, though he said nothing about them at the time. This version comes from an interview conducted in 1912 with Kehl's daughter Anna, who was living in a German community in Missouri by then and had left Millbrook in 1891. The interview was conducted by a Lutheran minister who was compiling histories of German immigrant communities, and it was never published because Anna requested that her testimony remain confidential until after her death. The transcript was discovered in church archives in 1974. According to Anna's account, her father had been troubled by something he observed during the summer of 1883, but had kept his concerns to himself because he didn't want to cause alarm over what might be nothing. What he had noticed was that some of the community's children were meeting in the woods at night after their families had gone to sleep. He had discovered this by accident when he was tracking a deer that had been damaging his garden. He followed the deer into the forest just after dusk and heard voices, children's voices, speaking in low tones. He approached quietly and saw a group of about 8 or 9 children, ranging in age from perhaps 7 to 13, sitting in a circle around a small fire. They were not doing anything obviously harmful. They were talking, though he couldn't make out the words, But what disturbed him was the seriousness with which they conducted themselves, the formality of it. They were not playing. They were engaged in something that had the structure and gravity of a ritual, though he couldn't identify what kind. He confronted his own grandchildren about it the next day, but they denied having been in the woods. When he pressed them, they became upset and insisted they had been asleep. He didn't believe them, but he also couldn't prove they were lying, and the confrontation created a tension in his household that took weeks to dissipate. He decided not to raise the matter with other families, reasoning that doing so would only create conflict and division. But he watched more carefully after that, and he became convinced that the nighttime meetings continued, though the children were more cautious about being observed. These two versions, Catherine's and Ernst's, may describe the same phenomenon from different perspectives, or they may describe different aspects of what was happening in Millbrook during that period. Or one or both may be inaccurate, shaped by memory and the desire to impose narrative coherence on events that were at the time confusing and ambiguous. What is certain is that by the summer of 1884, enough people in the community were concerned about the children's behavior that several meetings were held to discuss the matter. The meetings took place in the church, which was the only building large enough to accommodate most of the adult population. No formal minutes were kept, but references to these gatherings appear in several personal documents from the period. A diary belonging to Margaret Yates, wife of one of the mill supervisors, contains brief entries about 3 such meetings in June and July of 1884. The entries are terse, almost cryptic. June 14th, meeting at church regarding children. Much discussion, no agreement on action. June 29th, another meeting. Pettigrew spoke at length. Some families angry, others frightened. July 18th, third meeting. Decision made, though not all accept it. God help us to know if we have chosen rightly. The decision that was made remains unclear from Yates's diary alone, but cross-referencing with other documents provides some clues. A letter from Jonas Pettigrew to a Baptist minister in a neighboring county, dated July 20th, 1884, asks for advice about a matter of moral instruction and discipline, involving children who have fallen under influences that their parents find troubling but difficult to identify clearly. Pettigrew's letter is careful, almost legalistic in its phrasing. He describes the situation in abstract terms, asking the minister's opinion about what obligations adults have when children engage in behavior that may be harmful but isn't explicitly wrong by any standard doctrine. The minister's response, if there was one, does not survive. A third document, a page torn from what appears to be a ledger or account book, was found in the 1920s, tucked inside a Bible that had belonged to one of Millbrook's families. The page contains a list of names, all children, with ages noted beside them. Approximately 30 names are listed. Next to some of the names are notations: spoke with family, family refuses cooperation, removed from influence. The handwriting is not identified, but the paper is consistent with what was available in Harrow County during the 1880s. These fragments suggest that the community attempted some kind of organized response to whatever was happening with the children, but that this response was neither unanimous nor entirely successful. Anna Cale's testimony provides more detail. According to her account, the meetings at the church revealed deep divisions within the community. Some families insisted that the children's behavior was harmless, that adults were overreacting to normal childhood imagination and play. Other families believed that the children had been influenced by something or someone dangerous, and that strong measures were necessary to protect them. The source of the influence was hotly debated. Some blamed a transient worker who had stayed in Millbrook briefly the previous winter, a man who had told strange stories and taught the children unusual songs before moving on. Others blamed books that had been brought into the settlement, or ideas picked up from other children when families traveled to neighboring towns. A few suggested that the influence was not external at all, but arose from something within the community itself, some failure of moral instruction or supervision. The meetings became increasingly heated. Accusations were made. Families who defended their children's innocence were accused of negligence or worse. Families who advocated strict discipline were accused of cruelty and paranoia. Jonas Pettigrew, now in his 70s, attempted to mediate. He proposed a measured approach. Increased supervision of the children, restrictions on where they could go unsupervised, conversations with families individually to address specific concerns without creating a climate of panic. But Pettigrew's authority, which had been nearly absolute during the mill's prosperous years, was waning. The mill's profits had been declining for several years due to increased competition and changing markets. Pettigrew's sons, who managed day-to-day operations, were viewed as less competent than their father. Some families felt that Pettigrew, precisely because he was old and had no young children in his household, didn't understand the urgency of the situation. A faction within the community, led by several of the more religiously conservative families, advocated for more aggressive action. They wanted the children questioned intensively, separated from each other if necessary, prohibited from any unsupervised activity until whatever influence had affected them was rooted out completely. This faction did not prevail at the meetings, but they did not abandon their position either. What happened next is where the accounts become most contradictory and least reliable. According to Catherine Hollis's letters to her sister, the situation seemed to improve somewhat in early August. The children stopped gathering in groups, stopped using the strange words and symbols that had concerned their parents. Catherine wrote that she didn't know if this was because the children had genuinely moved on to other interests, or because they had simply learned to be more secretive. But either way, the immediate crisis seemed to have passed. But according to Anna Keel's testimony, something different happened in August. She says that a group of families, she didn't know exactly who, because her father kept that information from her, took matters into their own hands. They confronted the children most involved in the troubling behavior and subjected them to what she delicately termed harsh interrogation. What this meant in practice, Anna didn't know or wouldn't say. She had heard fragments of conversations between adults, references to children being corrected or cleansed of influence, but the specifics were kept from her and other young people not directly involved. She did know that after whatever happened, several children in the community changed dramatically. They became withdrawn, refused to play with others, had nightmares. One boy, the son of a family named Pritchard, stopped speaking almost entirely and would flinch if anyone approached him suddenly. This, Anna said, was when her father decided the family would leave Millbrook. He had opposed the harsh measures from the beginning, had argued against them at the meetings, but he had been outvoted or overruled. When he saw the effects on the children, he told his wife they were leaving as soon as they could arrange it. They left in September 1884, telling people they were going to visit relatives in Ohio. They never returned. A third account, this one from Samuel Driscoll's 1952 interview, suggests something else entirely. Driscoll says he was too young to understand what was happening at the time, but he remembered that in August 1884, one of the children disappeared. The child was a girl, perhaps 10 or 11 years old. Driscoll couldn't recall her name, or said he couldn't. She had been part of the group that met in the woods, one of the children most involved in whatever had been going on, and then suddenly she wasn't there anymore. When Driscoll asked his parents where she had gone, they told him her family had sent her to live with relatives in another state. But he remembered that her parents were still in Millbrook, and they seemed strange, quiet in a way that wasn't normal grief or normal absence. They seemed relieved and terrified at the same time. Years later, as an adult, Driscoll had asked his father directly what had happened to the girl. His father had looked at him for a long moment and then said, Some questions are better left alone because the answers won't help anyone. When Driscoll pressed, his father said, "What I will tell you is that people sometimes do things they believe are necessary to protect others, and then they have to live with having done those things, and the only way they can live with it is to convince themselves it was necessary. Whether it actually was or not becomes less important than the fact that they did it and can't undo it." "Had the girl died?" Driscoll asked. His father wouldn't answer directly. "The girl is gone," he said. "That's all I know for certain." The fire that destroyed the Pettigrew mill occurred on the night of August 17th, 1884. The official report, a brief document filed with the county and preserved in the courthouse records, states that the fire began in the dry kiln, likely due to spontaneous combustion of sawdust and wood residue. The fire spread to the main mill building before it could be contained. No injuries were reported. The financial loss was estimated at $12,000, a significant sum for a rural mill of that size. The brevity of the report is notable. Most industrial fires, even in rural areas, generated more extensive documentation, insurance investigations, interviews with workers, assessments of whether safety protocols had been followed. For the Millbrook fire, there is only the single-page report, and even this appears to be a summary rather than a complete investigation. Rebecca Thorne, in her notes from 1889, wrote that she found the absence of detailed records suspicious. She attempted to locate insurance files, but was told by the company that had underwritten the mill's policy that their records from that period had been lost in a fire at their own offices in 1887. When she pointed out the improbable coincidence of two separate fires destroying records related to the same event, the insurance clerk suggested she was implying something improper and asked her to leave. Multiple witnesses from neighboring communities reported seeing the fire from miles away. The flames were visible for several hours, and the smoke column could be seen the next morning. Several men from Corsham rode out to Millbrook to offer assistance, but by the time they arrived, the fire had burned itself out, and there was nothing to do except help clear debris. One of these men, interviewed by Thorne in 1890, said that what struck him most about the scene was not the destruction, but the way the Millbrook residents received their help. They were grateful but strangely formal, almost ritualistic in their thanks, and they seemed eager for the outsiders to leave once the immediate help had been provided. "It felt," the man said, "like we had walked in on something private, something we weren't supposed to see. Not the fire itself, that was obvious enough, but the aftermath, the way people were with each other. There was a feeling of, I don't know how to put it, like they had just finished something difficult and exhausting, and they needed to be alone to recover from it." When Thorne asked if he thought the fire had been deliberately set, the man became uncomfortable. "I'm not saying that," he said. "I'm just saying it felt strange." The whole situation felt strange. Jonas Pettigrew died on September 29, 1884, 6 weeks after the fire. The death certificate lists the cause as general debility and exhaustion, a diagnosis common for elderly people who simply stopped living without any specific illness. He was 75 years old. His funeral was attended by most of the remaining Millbrook population and a few people from neighboring communities. The circuit preacher who conducted the service later told his wife that it was the most somber funeral he had ever overseen, and that the grief in the church seemed to be about more than the loss of one old man. Pettigrew's will, filed with the county in October, left the mill property to his 2 sons jointly. The will also contained a provision that surprised the lawyer who probated it. A sum of money, approximately $800, was to be distributed among the families of Millbrook for their children's welfare, with the exact distribution to be determined by community consensus rather than specified by Pettigrew himself. The sons attempted to rebuild the mill, but encountered immediate difficulties. The insurance settlement was delayed and then contested on grounds that were never fully explained. Loans that had seemed certain were suddenly unavailable. Suppliers who had worked with the Pettigrews for decades became evasive about extending credit. By the spring of 1885, it was clear that rebuilding would not be possible. The sons sold what equipment had survived the fire, sold some of the timber rights, and left Harrow County. One went to Oregon, as had been reported. The other went to Kentucky, where he opened a small hardware store and never spoke of Millbrook to anyone, including his children. The settlement did not empty immediately. The population declined from 112 in the 1880 census to 43 in the 1887 census, but those who remained showed no signs of planning to leave. They survived on subsistence farming, small-scale logging for local markets, and occasional wage work in neighboring towns. What they did not do was talk about what had happened. Rebecca Thorne's frustration with Millbrook is evident throughout her notes. She was an experienced journalist, skilled at interviewing reluctant subjects and piecing together stories from fragmentary evidence. But Millbrook defeated her. She made 7 visits to the settlement between 1889 and 1893, staying sometimes for a few days, once for nearly 2 weeks. She spoke with dozens of people. She was polite, patient, careful not to push too hard or seem accusatory. She explained repeatedly that she was interested in documenting the community's history, that rural settlements like Millbrook deserved to have their stories preserved. The responses were uniform in their evasiveness. People were willing to discuss the mill's operation, the timber industry, the practical challenges of rural life. They would talk about the weather, crops, the difficulty of maintaining roads and buildings with limited resources. But any question that touched on the period from 1883 to 1885 met with vague answers or polite deflection. Had there been problems with the children? Well, children were always a challenge, weren't they? But nothing specific that anyone could recall. Had there been disputes within the community? Every community had disagreements now and then. Nothing unusual. What about the fire? Tragic, of course. But these things happened. Mills were dangerous operations. Fires weren't uncommon. The missing girl that Samuel Driscoll had mentioned? Thorne asked several people about this, being careful to frame it as just trying to understand the community's demographics. The responses were confused. One person thought they remembered a family leaving because of illness. Another said no, that was a different family, and they'd left before the fire. A third said they didn't recall any children leaving, just adults seeking work elsewhere. When Thorne pointed out the contradictions, people shrugged. Memories were unreliable. It had been years ago. People mixed up details. The only person who came close to telling her anything useful was an old woman named Ida Pritchard, whose son had been one of the children involved in the woods meetings. Thorne found her alone one afternoon, working in her garden. The woman was in her 60s, thin and weathered, and she stopped her work willingly enough when Thorne approached. They talked about ordinary things first. The garden, the difficulty of keeping deer away from vegetables, the best methods for preserving food for winter. Then, when a comfortable rhythm had been established, Thorne asked about the woman's son. He left, Ida said. Went west. California, I believe. When did he leave? Oh, long time ago. 10 years, maybe more. Was he happy here before he left? The woman's hands, which had been pulling weeds, went still. Happy, she repeated. I don't know that happy is a word that applies much in places like this. People do what they have to do. They get by. Did something happen that made him want to leave? The woman looked at Thorne directly then, and Thorne later wrote that it was one of the most unnerving moments of her career. The woman's eyes were not hostile, not frightened, but utterly empty of anything Thorne could interpret. What happened, the woman said slowly, is that we all learned what we were capable of. And once you learn that, you have 2 choices. You can leave and try to forget it, or you can stay and learn to live with knowing it. My son left. I stayed. What were you capable of? Protecting what we thought needed protecting. Whether it did or not. And the cost of that protection, The woman returned to her weeding. "The cost is living with it," she said. "Every day, that's the cost." She wouldn't say anything more. When Thorne tried to continue the conversation, the woman simply stopped responding, working in silence until Thorne eventually gave up and left. Thorne's final visit to Millbrook was in the summer of 1893. By then, only 31 residents remained, most of them elderly. The houses were deteriorating. The church met only once a month. The school had closed for lack of children. She walked through the settlement, photographing buildings and landscapes with a camera she had borrowed for the purpose. The photographs still exist in a university archive, labeled only with Millbrook, Harrow County, 1893, and Thorne's initials. They show a community in obvious decline, but not yet abandoned. Gardens are still being tended. Laundry hangs on lines. Smoke rises from chimneys, but there are no people visible in any of the photographs, though Thorne must have seen people during her visit. She wrote in her journal that night, "They know I'm here to document their disappearance. They allow me to do it because they know that documentation without explanation is meaningless. I can photograph their houses, record their names, note that they existed. But without the story of what happened here, all of that is just inventory. And they will never tell the story. They have agreed collectively that the story dies with them, and I cannot force them to break that agreement." A week later, she wrote to her editor that she was abandoning the Millbrook project. There was no article to be written because there were no facts she could verify sufficiently to publish. She had fragments, contradictions, impressions, but nothing that met the standards of responsible journalism. The editor wrote back suggesting she write a piece about how some rural communities resisted documentation, about the gap between official records and lived experience. Thorne considered this but ultimately decided against it. She felt that even writing about Millbrook's silence would be a kind of violation, an exposure of something they had worked deliberately to protect. She never wrote about Millbrook at all. The settlement continued its slow disappearance through the 1890s and into the early 1900s. By 1900, 23 residents remained. By 1905, fewer than 15. By 1910, only a handful. Ada Firth, the last resident, had come to Millbrook as a young woman in 1868, married to a mill worker who had died in an accident in 1879. She had no children, no close family, and apparently no desire to live anywhere else. After everyone else had left or died, she stayed on in the house she had shared with her husband, maintaining a small garden, keeping chickens, living on almost nothing. The county doctor who visited her in 1915 found her in acceptable health for a woman of her age. He noted that she was lucid and capable of caring for herself, though she spoke very little. When he asked if she had anyone who could check on her periodically, she said she preferred solitude and did not want visitors. "But what if something happens to you?" the doctor asked. "Then it happens," she said. "I've lived here more than 40 years. If I die here, that's fitting enough." The doctor reported this conversation to the county authorities, who decided that if the woman was competent and didn't want help, they had no legal basis to force it on her. She lived alone for 2 more years. In December 1917, a mail carrier who occasionally left supplies at the edge of the settlement noticed that smoke had not risen from her chimney for several days. He investigated and found her dead in her bed, apparently having passed in her sleep. The county took care of the burial. A few men went to prepare the house for eventual sale, but there was almost nothing in it worth taking. They buried her in the Millbrook Cemetery, which by then was heavily overgrown. They used a field stone to mark the grave because no one knew if she would have wanted a formal headstone, and there was no one to ask. One of the men who helped with the burial later said that the strangest thing about that day was the silence. Not just the absence of people, but the quality of the silence, thick, almost tangible, like the air itself was holding its breath. "I kept expecting to hear something," he said. "Birds, wind, something. But there was nothing. Just us and the work we were doing, and the feeling that we were finishing something that had been going on much longer than we understood. After Ada Firth's death, Millbrook ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. The buildings collapsed gradually over the next decade. The forest, which had been held back by human activity, reclaimed the cleared land. By the 1920s, most of the structures were gone, either fallen completely or so overtaken by vegetation that they were indistinguishable from the natural landscape. The roads grew over. The property reverted to the county for unpaid taxes. No one came to claim it. No one wanted it. For several decades, Millbrook was simply forgotten, not deliberately suppressed or hidden, but erased through ordinary processes of time and disinterest. The people who had lived there were dead. The people who had known those people were dying. The reasons for remembering the settlement or for avoiding remembering it faded along with the generation that had held them. But then, in the 1950s and 1960s, there was a brief revival of interest in local history. County historical societies were formed, old records were examined, elderly residents were interviewed about their memories of earlier times. It was during this period that some of the documents about Millbrook surfaced: Catherine Hollis's letters, Anna Keel's testimony, Samuel Driscoll's interview, fragments of Rebecca Thorne's notes. People began to realize that there was a story here, or at least the outline of one, but the story remained incomplete. The documents raised more questions than they answered, and the people who might have filled in the gaps were long dead. Attempts were made to investigate further. Graduate students proposed theses. Local historians tried to map the settlement's location with precision, but the physical evidence was gone, and the documentary evidence was too fragmentary and contradictory to support definitive conclusions. What remained was speculation, and speculation gradually hardened into folklore. By the 1970s and 1980s, Millbrook had entered the realm of regional legend. People in Harrow County who had never heard of it before suddenly had stories about it, stories that bore little resemblance to the documented history, but had the satisfying completeness that real history rarely provides. In these stories, Millbrook was haunted. Children had made pacts with dark forces. The fire had been divine retribution. The settlement had been cursed, and that was why everyone eventually left or died. The actual documents, the letters, the testimonies, the notes, were rarely consulted. They were too ambiguous, too unsatisfying. They suggested human failure and human complicity rather than supernatural intervention, and human failure was less interesting than haunting. The few serious researchers who tried to cut through the folklore and get at what had actually happened found themselves stymied by the same problems that had frustrated Rebecca Thorne a century earlier. The evidence was fragmentary, the witnesses were dead, and the community had organized itself around not telling. One researcher, a professor of Appalachian history named Martin Coyle, spent 3 years in the 1980s trying to piece together Millbrook's story. He located descendants of families who had lived there, tracked down documents in scattered archives, even attempted to excavate the cemetery site to determine how many people were actually buried there. His efforts produced a monograph published by a small university press in 1987. The monograph carefully laid out what was known and what was merely suggested by the evidence. It refrained from speculation and acknowledged frankly that major questions remained unanswered. The central conclusion of Coyle's research was that something had happened in Millbrook between 1883 and 1885 involving the community's children, that the adult response to this event had been divisive and possibly extreme, and that the fire at the mill may or may not have been connected to these events. Beyond that, he could not say with certainty what had occurred or why the community had maintained such complete silence about it. The monograph sold poorly and attracted little attention outside of academic circles. Coyle moved on to other projects and died in 2003 without having returned to the Millbrook question. His research notes, deposited at a state university, remain available to anyone who wants to continue the investigation. But no one has. The topic appears to be exhausted, all useful sources examined, all productive lines of inquiry pursued as far as they can go. What remains now, in the early 21st century, is primarily absence. The land where Millbrook stood is part of a state forest. The cemetery, if it can be located at all, is unmarked and overgrown. The creek still runs through the valley, and the oak and hickory are tall again, having regrown from the stumps left by Pettigrew's crews more than a century ago. Occasionally, hikers pass through the area. Some know they are walking through the site of a former settlement. Most do not. There are no markers, no historical signs, nothing to indicate that people once lived and worked and died here. The absence is so complete that it has become its own kind of presence, a negative space that draws attention precisely because there is nothing there. People in Harrow County, if asked about Millbrook, will usually say they've heard of it but don't know much about it. Some will mention the folklore, the ghost stories, the curses, the various supernatural explanations that have accreted around the settlement's memory, but very few know anything about the actual history, and fewer still care to investigate further. There is a sense that Millbrook is a topic better left alone, though most people would be hard-pressed to explain why. It's just one of those things, they might say. Old settlement that didn't make it, nothing special about it. Why dwell on it? This casual dismissal is itself revealing. Thousands of rural settlements failed during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Most of them are subjects of mild historical interest, preserved in photographs, documented in local histories, occasionally commemorated with historical markers or small museums. Millbrook alone provokes this particular quality of disinterest, this active preference for not knowing that masquerades as simple lack of curiosity. The final document in the Millbrook archive, if such a scattered collection of materials can be called an archive, is a letter written in 1962 by the daughter of Samuel Driscoll. Her name was Helen Driscoll Mason, and she wrote to Martin Coyle after reading a newspaper article about his research. She had been going through her father's papers after his death and found something she thought might be relevant. It was a single page, handwritten, apparently composed by Samuel Driscoll sometime in the 1950s, but never sent to anyone. The handwriting was shaky but legible. The page read, "I have thought many times about writing this down, and many times decided against it. But I am old now, and perhaps it matters less whether I speak or stay silent. What I remember about Millbrook is this. We were afraid, not of anything supernatural or impossible. We were afraid of what we might be capable of if we believed it was necessary. We were afraid that protecting our children might require us to harm them. We were afraid that staying together as a community might require us to accept things we knew were wrong. We were afraid that speaking about any of this would destroy us, and we were afraid that not speaking about it would destroy us differently. In the end, we chose silence. We chose to carry what happened without naming it, without examining it, without deciding collectively whether it had been justified or monstrous or something in between. And the silence consumed us slowly, over decades. Not dramatically, not all at once, but bit by bit, family by family, we were hollowed out by what we would not say. I left because I could not bear to stay, but I never spoke of it either, so perhaps I am just as guilty as those who remained. Perhaps we are all guilty. Perhaps the guilt is the point. What happened to the child I do not know. I believe she died. I believe we killed her collectively through action or inaction or some combination of both. But I do not know for certain, and no one who might know has ever told me. This is my confession, though I do not know what I am confessing to. We refuse to name it. We refuse still. And that refusal is the only thing that survived. Helen Mason's letter to Coyle asked if this fragment meant anything to him, if it fit with anything he had discovered in his research. She said her father had never spoken to her about Millbrook, except to say it was a place he had lived as a child and had not returned to. Coyle wrote back thanking her for the document and explaining that it confirmed some of his suspicions, but did not provide the definitive answers he had been seeking. He asked if she had any other papers from her father's estate. She replied that there was nothing else related to Millbrook, and that she would prefer not to be contacted about the matter again, as thinking about it disturbed her in ways she couldn't fully explain. The correspondence ended there. In 2015, a documentary filmmaker contacted the Harrow County Historical Society with a proposal to make a film about Millbrook. The proposal described the project as an investigation into America's forgotten communities and promised to handle the subject with sensitivity and historical rigor. The Historical Society's board discussed the proposal at length. Some members were interested, seeing it as an opportunity to bring attention to their work. Others were opposed, though they struggled to articulate exactly why. Eventually, the board decided to decline the filmmaker's request for assistance. In their response, they explained that while they appreciated his interest, they felt that Millbrook's story was too fragmentary and speculative to be the subject of responsible documentary work, and that they did not want to contribute to further mythologizing of the settlement. The filmmaker responded that he understood their concerns and thanked them for their time. The documentary was never made. One of the board members later told a colleague that declining the request had been the right decision, but that she still felt uneasy about it, as if by refusing to help tell the story, they were perpetuating the very silence that had defined Millbrook in the first place. "But what else could we do?" she asked. "Tell a story we don't understand, make up answers to fill in the gaps." Sometimes the most honest thing you can say is, "We don't know," even if that's deeply unsatisfying. The community that refused to name it exists now only as a question that cannot be answered, a story that cannot be told, a silence that has outlasted every voice that might have broken it. What they refused to name may have been a crime, an accident, a shared delusion, a moment of collective madness, or something else entirely. It may have been real or imagined, justified or monstrous, necessary or unforgivable. All that is certain is that they chose not to name it, and that choice became the defining feature of their community. More important than their work, their faith, their families, or their survival, they chose silence, and the silence consumed them. And now, more than a century later, even the memory of what they were silent about has dissolved, leaving only the fact of the silence itself, preserved in fragments and contradictions, and the persistent unease of those who encounter Millbrook's story and cannot make sense of it. The forest grows where they lived. The creek runs where it always has. The sky is the same sky they looked at when they made their choice and lived with the consequences. Nothing marks the place. Nothing names what happened there. Nothing breaks the silence they established so carefully and maintained so completely that it survived them all. The community that refused to name it is gone, but the refusal remains, embedded now in the landscape itself, in the gaps in the county records, in the fragmentary documents that raise more questions than they answer, in the persistent sense that something happened here that should not be examined too closely. They succeeded in the end in protecting their secret. The cost of that protection was everything else.